Hey YouTube, it's FSX Genius and welcome to flight school tutorial number 5, and we're going to go back to the classroom a little bit for this particular tutorial, and we're going to do something called circuit flying. Now a circuit, if you just have a look at the screen now, we've got a nice overhead view of an airport. Now circuits, we have left-hand circuits and right-hand circuits, and that just depends whether you're going anti-clockwise or clockwise. So in this particular demonstration we're going to do a left-hand circuit. So on the screen I'm going to show you each and every stage of that circuit. So beginning, we're on the runway and we begin our takeoff phase. Now the takeoff phase obviously is a standard takeoff, and we're going to have various points to make note of as we're doing this takeoff. After that initial takeoff, we'll climb and we'll make an initial 90-degree left-hand turn. This is a left-hand circuit. If it was a right-hand circuit, we would turn 90 degrees to the right. After that turn, we then continue our climb up to our circuit altitude. Now for this particular circuit, we're going to be climbing to 1,000 feet, but you can set different altitudes in different circuits. After that initial climb, we then do another 90-degree left-hand turn, and we're onto what we call the downwind leg. In other words, we're flying in the opposite direction, away from, parallel to the runway, but in the opposite direction that we took off. And then we get to a point called key point. Now you can see here where the red line ends, we have the key point, and the key point is the point parallel and opposite to where you want to touch down. So at the key point, that's where you would look out of your window and be looking at the runway, either to your left or to your right, and looking for the point where you want to watch down, when you want to touch down. And as you get to that touchdown stage, that's when we get to what we call the key point, and I'll tell you what to do when we get to the key point as we go through the tutorial. Obviously then we have a continuation of the flight and another 90-degree left-hand turn onto what we call the base leg. Now the base leg is obviously the last part of the circuit before we then turn onto the finals towards the runway. So we have the base leg and then turning finally onto the runway, and we're going to pass over the runway threshold and land. Now we don't have to land and come to a complete stop, we can go on and do this again, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to do a couple of these circuits when we get to the actual flying part. Okay, so there's a few things that we need to think about when we're doing a circuit, and there's things that we're going to look at once we're in the aircraft, but I'm going to show you them on here first of all. Now it's going to be a Cessna that we're going to be flying. I'm going to be flying the FSX Genius training Cessna, as it's already liveried up, and it's the standard stock Cessna. Oh, can't speak today. It's the standard stock Cessna within FSX. When we get to 55 knots, we're going to rotate. Now we're taking off with flaps. 10 degrees of flaps, so if I say flaps 10, it just means 10 degrees of flaps. But it's the first stage on your flaps. And once we've established a positive rate of climb, so we're going upwards and we're clear of all obstacles, left, right, below and above, we're going to go to a flaps up position. Then we're going to use the pitch of the aircraft, in other words whether it's nose up or nose down, to maintain 80 knots climb rate during our climb out. That's important because we want to have a steady speed for our climb out. Remember, we're going to have full power during takeoff, so we're just pitching the nose up or pitching the nose down to help maintain 80 knots. So that's the climb out phase. At 500 feet above the field elevation, that's the elevation above the runway, not your elevation above sea level, and I'll show you how to set that. At 500 feet, we're going to begin our initial turn. Now, it's a 90-degree turn to the left in the example that we're going to do, but it could be a 90-degree turn to the right. And we're going to adjust the pitch using the flight stick or the yoke to maintain 80 knots during that turn, because remember, your aircraft will want to nose down a little bit during a turn. And we're going to show you as well, on your artificial horizon, when we're climbing and turning, we don't really want to exceed a 20-degree bank angle. We don't want to lean over too far. We want to keep the aircraft nice and stable, and I'll show you how to measure that 20-degree bank angle during that initial turn. And we're going to make that 90-degree turn and level out and continue climbing. Now when we get to 1,000 feet, we're going to reduce the engine power down to 1,200 revs per minute. So we're going to look at the RPM gauge again. We'll discuss it once we get in the aircraft. We're going to reduce that down to 1,200 and make our 90-degree turn left onto the downwind leg. That's the leg where we're flying in the opposite direction to the runway, parallel to it. Okay, so another 90-degree left-hand turn to the left at 1,200 RPM set. And we're going to maintain level flight and just adjust the trim so that we maintain that level flight. Now this is the key point that I was explaining. The key point, if you can see on the image that's on your screen at the moment, is where we're hoping to touch down. When we pass that point going in the opposite direction, we're going to reduce the RPM, the revs on the engine, down to 1,600. And we're going to set flaps 10, and we're going to slightly nose down the aircraft, or nose up the aircraft, so that we maintain a steady 80 knots. Okay? So that's a key point. When we pass that point, we will go rev start to 1600, flaps 10 degrees, first stage of flaps, and adjust the pitch of the aircraft to maintain that 80 knots. Once we've got that established, and we're established at 80 knots, we're going to think about making a turn onto the base leg. When we turn onto the base leg, we just need to ease back a little bit on the flight stick or the yoke to reduce the speed to 75 knots, and then make a turn 90 degrees to the left again, so that we can maintain 75 knots. We're going to be adjusting the pitch of the aircraft until we're flying along the base leg of this particular circuit. Then, as we're getting close to wanting to turn onto our finals, we're going to again ease back on the flight yoke a little bit and adjust the pitch of the aircraft to maintain 70 knots. Okay, and then as we turn onto final, so we're lining up with the runway, we're going to go to flaps 20 or full flaps. It depends on the wind conditions, but we're going to use flaps 20 in this particular example. The final thing to take account is that as we pass over that runway threshold, we should have adjusted the pitch of the aircraft so that we're flying at 60 knots over that runway threshold. So as we fly over the threshold, we want to be doing no more than 60 knots and preparing for landing. So let's get to the aircraft, and before we actually start doing the circuit, we're just going to recap a few things to do with how to control speed and how to control pitch and things like that in the aircraft. So let's get into Flight Simulator. Okay, so just a quick reminder about some of the things that we need to practice while we're doing these circuits. At the moment I'm at about 1,600 feet, and I've trimmed the aircraft pretty much for level flight. Let's have a look at some of the dials here just to remind us. So you can see that the vertical speed indicator here is at 0, so we're actually flying level, we're not climbing or descending. It's just starting to climb a little bit, so we just trim down again slightly. And we're just constantly controlling that trim, and the speeds are at around 90 knots. This dial down here is your engine rev counter, so it's the revs per minute, and at the moment it's set to about 2,200, maintaining 90 knots. And we're just kind of climbing a little bit, so we're just trimming down. Again, we're just adjusting the trim all the time. It's a very ongoing thing, is adjusting trim and maintaining level flight. Now, a few things that I want to go over. So we know about the airspeed indicator, we know about the altimeter, this is the rev counter, we've also got our heading selector here in the middle. And we've also got our turn coordinator. Now, I want to concentrate on this artificial horizon first of all. You can see here that there's some marks on the artificial horizon outside edge, and these indicate 10 degrees of bank angle for each one. So the first one is 10 degrees of bank angle, 20 degrees and 30 degrees. They're the ones that we're going to be concentrating on. This one down here is 60 degrees of bank angle. We're not going to touch that today. Now we're going to think about a turn, and when we make a turn, well, I'm going to show you something and watch what happens. Now, it might be difficult for you to see. I'll try and just zoom in a little bit for you, just so you can see this. Okay, we're going to bank the aircraft over to the left on a 30-degree turn, so we're going to line this arrow here up with this particular marker. So we'll do that first of all. So we're going to go over. Now, if I just simply turn to the left, watch what happens to the vertical speed indicator. You can see that we're actually diving, we're losing altitude as we do that. So let's just level out. And the speed picked up because we dived as well. So there's a lot going on during that particular turn. Now this time we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to re-establish level flight first of all. So I'm just trimming for level flight, letting the speed come back down to a more sensible and manageable speed. This time we're going to go over to a 30-degree turn, but we're going to pull back on the flight stick or the yoke, depending on what controllers you're using, in order to keep this vertical speed indicator as close to 0 as possible during that turn. Now, we're not using any rudder control, because rudder is set to auto in Microsoft Flight Simulator X at the moment, because we've not gotten to how to control rudder. So we've left that set to auto, and we're going to now bank over to 30 degrees, but we're going to pull slightly back on the stick at the same time. So that's 30 degrees. And we're using the pitch of the aircraft to maintain level flight. You can see we're descending a little bit, so there you go. So that's a 30-degree turn. We're using the yoke to maintain the level flight. And there you go, that's established now. 30 degree left hand banking turn, and we're maintaining level flight. So we need to be aware that we have to pull back on the stick slightly in order to maintain that level turn. And it's the same when climbing or descending, so let's level the aircraft up. Use the yoke to control the pitch up or down. And the other thing that we need to remind ourselves of is how to control speed during climb or descent. Now I'm going to go to full power, and I'm going to start climbing. Now we've gone to full power, you can see the aircraft naturally starts to pitch up in the air as the speed increases. What we're going to do is we're going to increase that pitch by pulling back on the yoke, and we're going to keep an eye on the speed indicator, and we're going to maintain an 80 knot climb by continuing to pull back. See the speed incoming, it's coming down. Now that's 80 knots. Now I'm using the forward and backwards on the flight yoke or the flight stick, depending on what you're using, to maintain that 80 knot climb. If I allow the nose to go down, we're still climbing, but the speed starts to come up. If I go up too much, the speed will actually come down. So it's about controlling the pitch of the aircraft, the nose up and nose down, to maintain the speed that you want during your climb or descent. We'll see the reverse of that now. I'm going to reduce the power right down to 1600 revs. That's down here on the rev counter, we're at 1600. And you can see that the aircraft is descending, but it's also gaining speed. So in order for me to, let me just level out, in order for me to maintain an 80 knot descent, there you go, we've controlled the speed of the descent by simply pitching up or pitching down. A little bit of turbulence there. Now if you imagine during that stage of flight where we now have to reduce our speed down to 70 knots, we simply ease back on the flight yoke, pull back on the stick, and wait for the speed to come down. So that's 75 knots. And there's 70 knots. So we're now descending at 70 knots by simply controlling the pitch of the aircraft. We're using the pitch to control the speed. We're not touching the power settings at all. We've set that at 1600 RPM. And we're controlling the speed of the descent simply by adjusting the pitch of the aircraft. So with that in mind, just remember, on the turn indicators we've got the 10, 20 and 30 degree markers. We're going to use a 20 degree marker during climb, we're going to use a 30 degree marker during descent, and we're going to use the rev counter, the RPM, revs per minute of the engine. We're going to set it on our downwind phase to 2100, and as we're doing our approach to the airport past key point, it's going to be down to 1600 RPM, and the speed indicator. So all of those things you need to be aware of during your approach and during these circuit flying. So let's get onto the runway and we'll actually try doing some circuits. Okay, so we're on the runway, and this is the C-172 Cessna, which is the stock Cessna that comes with Microsoft Flight Simulator X, and it's obviously in the FSX Genius livery there that you can see, and we're inside the cockpit. Now let's have a look at some of the dials, because there are a few things that we need to set. You can see at the moment that the altimeter is registering about 90 feet above sea level, and the reason that it's doing that is because that's the airport, is basically 90 feet above sea level. We've set the barometric pressure to the local barometric readings, so everything's accurate. Now for flying circuits we actually want to know the field elevation, and in order to do that what we're going to do is we're going to use this knob here, and we're just going to wind the altimeter down so it reads 0 when we're on the runway. We call this the QFE. The QFE is the reading that you need to put in to tell you that 0 feet, or the elevation of the airfield, is at 0 feet on your altimeter. That way we know that when we do get to 500 feet, we're 500 feet above the airport. When we get to 1,000 feet, we're 1,000 feet above the airport, and so on and so forth. We're not actually taking into account how high the airport itself is above sea level. We only do this for circuits. The rest of the time, if we're doing other flying, we'll be actually setting it to the correct barometric pressure based on altitude above sea level. So Hope that makes sense. Down here we've got the revs per minute. Now we've got the direction indicator here, the heading selector, and what we're going to do is we're going to put the heading bug so it's lining up with our current heading, which is the runway heading. That way we know that we're just going to keep an eye on this bug, so when we make our first left hand turn 90 degrees, we want this to be here, facing here. When we make another turn and go on the downwind leg, it needs to be here. When we turn base, it needs to be here, and when we come back onto finals, it needs to be here. So that's why we set that there. We're not using autopilot, it's just a visual reference in the cockpit here for us. And that's pretty much it. We obviously know what the other dials do, we've discussed that, and in the first sort of like 12-13 minutes of this video. Let's have a look, and just for the sake of it, we're going to put our landing lights on and taxi lights on. We don't need nav lights on because it's daytime. Put the strobes on, and we'll put the pitot heat on as well. Down here we've got the trim wheel. We're going to set that for takeoff like we normally do. So just line up the two white indicators, and we are pretty much good to go. Now I know there's an awful lot of information in the first part of the video: speeds, engine revs, pitch and roll and turn and all those sort of things. So we're going to do a couple of circuits, a couple of touch and goes we call them, around this airport. I'm going to do a left hand circuit. So first stage of flaps in for takeoff, that's 10 degrees. Right, here we go then, so gently feeding the power in, and we're going to go full power. Watching these airspeed, 55 knots, begin to rotate. And we've got a positive rate of climb, clear of all obstructions. So we go to flaps up, and we keep the aircraft in a position where it can accelerate still up to 80 knots, which we're just reaching now, so we're going to pitch back a little bit, and we're going to maintain 80 knots during this initial climb. Now my eyes are on the speed, but also the altimeter as well, because I want to start my left hand turn at 500 feet, which is coming up now. So remember, it's a 20 degree turn when we're climbing, 20 degree bank angle, and we're going over to the second marker on the artificial horizon. And the thing that we're doing as well is we're watching the speed indicator, because we need to maintain 80 knots. If it starts getting fast, which it is doing, we're pulling back on the yoke slightly to slow it down. And when we've completed a 90 degree turn, we level out again. Now my eyes are back on the altimeter again, because at 1000 feet we want to come back to 2100 revs. So we're coming up on 1000 feet now, back to 2100, and let the aircraft level out and trim accordingly for level flight. So there we are, 2100 revs, level flight at 1000 feet. So we can begin our 90 degree turn, left hand turn, onto the downwind leg. Now as we do this turn, we're actually watching the vertical speed indicator, and we're using the pitch of the aircraft to make sure that we don't actually begin to ascend or descend during the turn. So over we go, 20 degrees again, pulling back on the yoke slightly, watching the vertical speed, making sure that stays at 0, watching the heading indicator as that comes round to directly beneath. So we're flying in the opposite direction to where we took off, and we're going to level out again. Okay, so we're going to look out the left hand window now, and we're going to look out for the key point. So we're looking at the point where we want to touch down. Keep checking our flight to make sure that we're level. And as we get parallel with the point where we actually want to touch down on the runway, we're going to reduce the engine revs down to about 1600, and we're going to go to flaps stage 1. Okay, so we're pretty much parallel with the point where we're going to touch down, so here we go. Engine revs down to 1600, and flaps to stage 1. And we want to maintain 80 knots now. You may just need to trim the throttle slightly just to make sure that you are at 1600 RPM, which we are. We're established at 80 knots or near enough, so we're going to turn left onto base, and as we do that we're going to use the pitch of the aircraft to reduce our speed slightly, so we're going to come down to about 75 knots as we do this. So there we are, we're maintaining 75 knots. So we have the runway in sight over here to our left. So we're going to make our final turn onto our finals. And when we do that, as we turn onto finals, we're going to go to flaps 20, make sure the speed's down to 70, and then continue to reduce the speed using with the pitch down to 60 as we fly over the runway threshold. So over we go, and using the pitch again to bring the speed to 70. I'm going to go to flaps 20 degrees. Now we're a little bit low, so what we can do is bring the power in just a little bit. Remember, we can use the power to reduce our rate of descent and the pitch of the aircraft to control the speed. RPM back to 1600, 60 knots as we go over the runway threshold, and as we pass over runway threshold, power off, keep the aircraft flying for as long as possible, and we've touched down. So flaps back to 10 degrees, power back to full, and we'll go do it again. There's 55 knots, rotate, positive rate, clear of all obstacles, flaps up, and 80 knots established in the climb. So again, eyes back on the altimeter now, 500 feet, we're going to do that turn again. Here comes 500 feet, so we're going to go left 20 degrees, easing back on the flight yoke ever so slightly, just so that we don't begin to accelerate. .90 degrees complete, so level up, and eyes back on the altimeter again. .1000 feet coming up, RPM back to 2100, let the aircraft nose begin to come down, and trimming for level flight. Level flight's established, so we're going to turn now onto our downwind leg again. Remember, we're using the pitch of the aircraft this time to control the vertical speed, make sure we're not climbing or descending as we do this turn. Coming around to parallel with the runway, so we're going to level up. And we're looking out of the window now for our key point. So there's key point, and as before, engine RPM is down to 1600 and flaps to the first stage, 10 degrees of flaps. And maintaining 80 knots as we begin our descent because we've reduced the engine power. Turning onto base now, so a nice turn. We're going to slow the aircraft down using pitch down to about 75 knots as we turn onto base. And we're now on base. Keeping our eyes open now for the runway, so we're going to begin our left-hand turn onto final soon, and as we do that we're going to use pitch to slow the aircraft down to 70 knots. Let's begin that turn now. As we turn onto this final, we're at 70 knots, we're going to go to flaps 20 degrees. As usual, the cat's turned up just as I'm about to do a landing. And we're approaching runway threshold, so if you remember, we're going to ease back now to slow the aircraft down to 60 knots as we pass over the runway threshold. There you are, 60 knots established. As we pass over threshold, power to 0, and keep the aircraft flying as long as possible, and touchdown. So there you go, that's how we're flying circuits. I really can't stress how important it is to practice these circuits again and again. Because what's going to happen is, as you're approaching an airport when you're flying in perhaps multiplayer, they may tell you to enter the circuit right-hand circuit, in other words you're making all right-hand turns, or enter the circuit left-hand circuit, in other words you're making all left-hand turns like we've just done. So they may say enter left-hand circuit downwind for landing runway 22. So when you fly into the airport, you would be preparing to turn right onto the downwind leg for the left-hand circuit. They may tell you to enter circuit base, left circuit base, in which case you'd be entering the base leg. You'd fly straight to the base leg and then make your left-hand turn to the runway. So that's why we practice circuits. It's how we would approach the airports if we were doing a circuit approach to an individual airport. So go away, watch this video a few times if you need to. There's lots and lots to take in. There's a lot of information, particularly in the first part of the video, about what power settings we're using and everything else, and practice those until they've pretty much become second nature to you. And then in the next video we'll take that a little bit further and we'll apply it to some visual approaches in some of the lighter jet aircraft. So thanks again for watching. I'm FSX Genius. You can always come and subscribe on the YouTube channel, come visit me on the Facebook page and click the like button. I also have a Twitch account as well, and you'll occasionally see me on the live stream. Just search FSX Genius on twitch.tv. Thanks for watching.